I'm pleased now to introduce Sian Harris, Dr. Sian Harris, who's the editor from Research Information and a scientific journalist. So, without ado.
Hello. Thank you, Adrian, for the introduction. As he said, and as you're probably already aware, I've been a journalist for the past 14 years. Been on Research Information since 2004, but before that I worked on a number of scientific magazines and websites at the Institute of Physics Publishing, and I've also worked on some other more scientific magazines than Research Information. So I'm here to provide you with a perspective of scholarly information from the perspective of a journalist. So there's much talk about access to scientific research articles. Been following open access hashtag on Twitter, and it seems that some people eat, sleep and breathe open access. You know who you are. What seems less talked about is the way that many people, especially members of the public and researchers outside their specialties, find out about the latest developments through the medium of science and technology journalists. So it's no secret, I'm sure, to anyone in this room that even the best written papers can be a dull read. And the exciting parts are often at the end of the articles, with little to signpost what's really interesting if you're not specifically in that field. So I believe that expert journalists play an important role in decoding the science and helping others to understand what's happened and the implications to them. So inevitably, people will listen to this and think of examples where things haven't gone so well. For example, the MMR vaccinations in this country and the fears about them that led to a drop in immunisations and a rise in childhood diseases. But I believe there's a lot more good examples. For example, the extensive coverage that the Higgs boson developments have had in the media has at least meant, I think, that members of the public will know, something interesting happened at CERN. And I've got a photo of the Paralympic Open ceremony. So this is, you may not have spotted initially, but this is the Higgs boson particle. My friend who was actually there and took this photo has actually been to CERN, but funnily enough, she didn't actually find out what it was until she got home. So it's not just the public. Researchers as well find magazine articles and websites in their general area a good way to keep up to date with trends in their subject without spending their entire time reading research papers and not actually managing to do any research. Time and again with Research Information I find people talk about information overload, and so specialist journalists can provide a snapshot of the research landscape to help deal with that kind of thing. I should clarify at this stage that what I'm talking about is science and technology journalists, and undoubtedly there's things in mainstream press that are written by non-scientists that are, there's coverage of science and all sorts of things, but that's a different issue and may not be served so much by the issues that I'm going to be discussing here, although I think that mainstream newspapers and things quite often use specialist articles as a source. So, given what I'm saying, that science and technology journalists do have an important role as a bridge, I'm going to talk about some of the ways that I believe that information flow between scholarly publishers and science and technology journalists could be improved. So, there's another picture from the Paralympic ceremony just because it's good. That's a particle track, apparently. So I'm going to explain who science and technology journalists are and how we work, some of the challenges we face, and then give you some suggestions for improving communication. So I think it's interesting in considering this, to think about what kind of people are science and technology journalists. And I think it's interesting to regard us as not a different species, but to recognize there's a lot of things that are very similar to the kind of backgrounds that people who go into being journal editors and journal publishers and this sort of thing go into. So most of the science and technology journalists I know don't have journalism degrees. I don't have a journalism degree. I have a PhD in inorganic chemistry. And that's true for most of the people that I know, not necessarily the chemistry aspect. But I think there's some of the same sort of traits in the sort of across the publishing industry, across the specialist publishing industry. The scientific or engineering backgrounds, they're being picky about grammar and scientific accuracy. Also, I've not added this in this list, but it seems a common theme across the publishing industry, a fondness for beer and wine. And I know that that's what we're doing later, I expect. So, how do we work? There are some differences between journalists in the mainstream press and specialist writers, and this session is entitled News of the World, so I'd like to take the opportunity to point out some of the ways we don't work. Okay, so this is not my style. For the record, I've never listened at doors for that big gold-green open access bust-up, tapped the phones of people considering copyright exceptions, rummaged through the bins of any publishers, or dressed up in disguise, do you like my wig, by the way, and bribed librarians to tell me which publishers they intend to boycott, which journals they intend to boycott. Instead, we have some more reputable sources of information. So, a common primary starting point for journalists is to look at press releases. Some early filtering, beyond what's done in the editorial and peer review processes, is done by public relations departments and marketing departments. We can get press releases from journal publishers or from universities or both. And I spoke to, I didn't say before, but in the run-up to this presentation, I spoke to a number of friends and colleagues and former colleagues who are science and technology journalists and got their perspectives on some of what I see as key issues. And there were some very common themes that came through. So most of the people I spoke to cited press release sources such as Alpha Galileo and Eureka Alert. And if you haven't heard of them and you're a publisher and thinking of publishing press releases about research, I'll tell you some more about them afterwards. Or in addition to press feeds from a few selected journals, particularly Science and Nature, people mentioned a lot. So probably for obvious reasons. And such press releases generally point back to the original paper and may give instructions about gaining access to the paper. So, of course, press releases aren't the only way to find out what's going on, and in a way, they provide just things that everyone else has access to as well. So it's not great for a unique angle on a story. When I have time, I find journal tables of contents useful. As you know, of course, there are thousands of journals and thousands of tables of contents, so it can be kind of hit and miss to find particular things if you're just looking for general things, general articles, and not particularly fussed about the sort of subject area. The journalists who I spoke to who work in very specific fields tended to say, I look at this journal, and this journal, and this journal, and then I try and get access to the papers. And I find also discovery tools are great for finding contacts for an overview of a research area. Whichever way you find access, when we find access to the papers, they're used in roughly sort of two main ways. News stories about a fresh piece of research, and this is the kind of thing that, say that a journalist released that week, and you'll ring the researchers and find out what they've been doing, find out the latest things they're working on, because of course the journal article will be a little bit out of date in terms of the latest research and what their plans are. Or there's the other way, is to be writing about a more broad research area and then find contacts for a lot of different people and talk to them about those kind of things they're doing. There are, of course, other sources. No time to go into them all really in any detail, but conferences are a brilliant source. So that's why I'm here at this conference. Personal communication, that's a great way to find stories. Some people I spoke to mentioned that researchers send their papers to them directly. And they said this is a great source, but sometimes wish the researchers would know to send their papers straight away rather than 6 months after they've been published. Depending what field you're working in, patent applications are a great source. I used to write about mobile telecoms technology, and they were a great source for this. A lot of things were not really published so much in the scholarly research, but much more published in patents. And then there's corporate news. This is the other kind of thing that's much more, that's particularly relevant for applied research areas, especially when companies don't want to publish in scientific journals because they like to keep things secret until their product launch. And other journalist articles. Of course, it would be foolish to, for any publication, not to keep an eye on what their competitors are doing. And I believe this is, as I said before, a way that much of the Main Street press finds out what's going on in scholarly research. And there are some limitations, though. There's particularly some limitations with press releases. One of the first of these is the possibility for spin or bias. The fact that things are being selected by a marketing department or a PR department means that they may not be specifically what I'm looking for or another journalist is looking for. And often, particularly if things are written by universities rather than publishers, there's a spin that can distort the research. I think an example a year or so ago, a press release, it was sent in 2011, about some figure that had fallen dramatically by, I think, 42% between 2002 and 2009. Now, as I like to be picky about other people's data that they're quoting, I noticed that 2011, why are they only giving me the data up to 2009, and why have they started at 2002? Well, it turned out when I looked at the raw data that in 2001 the figure had been much lower than 2002, and by 2010 the figure was much higher than 2009. So basically, although there was a 42% drop if you just took the figure from 2002 to 2009, from 2001 to 2010 it was steady. It was it was still actually an interesting story, but not anywhere near as sensational as the release suggested. And of course, research papers are not immune to this themselves. I was looking at an abstract the other day which mentioned some figure that had, from the 1970s, had increased from not much more than a third to nearly 40%. Which, the story was maybe still interesting, but the growth wasn't anywhere near as much as the choice of language suggested. Not comprehensive, I mentioned already, they're selected by PR departments often. And there's also, I find, a reluctance to share. Sometimes people want to filter for me, and they want to send things to their, whoever they've decided is the journalist they really fancy covering that story first. And then they wait for that person to decide whether they want to cover it before sharing with other people, which I don't think is a good plan, because I wouldn't. Some of these issues also come down to access, and of course there's no way that I could not mention access. So these are some of the quotes from my friends. It came up in every single person I spoke to and said, what are the big challenges you face with writing about scholarly research? They said access. So here are some quotes here. Only 2 people didn't register it as a really big challenge. One of this was because they wrote mainly from corporate news sources, so didn't really use scholarly papers very much. And the other one worked essentially as a front end to a scientific journal, and therefore had a close relationship with that journal and access to the same kind of papers that the journal editor had. I'm aware that as editor of research information, I'm luckier than most because I know people in a lot of big publishers. So should there be an issue where I needed access to a paper, I could probably email someone I know and say, do you think I could have access to this paper? For a journalist who doesn't know any of you guys, this is more difficult, and there's all sorts of online forms and things to fill in for access to a single article from a single journal that may or may not be relevant. This is, of course, a challenge for specialist journalists. I imagine it's even more of a challenge for the reporter who comes into a national paper and is told, okay, you're on a science desk today, write me 6 stories. The issue of access, I think, does potentially bring in a bias with journalism as well, because there is potential bias towards free stuff. I've found, and other people have said, even working in scholarly publishers, for scholarship publishers, it can be easier to find stories in open access journals published by somebody else than it can be to find stories in the journals published by your own publisher. Of course, this failure of internal communications isn't surprising. Communication and knowledge transfer between different departments with different management teams and different budgets is often poor. A simple conversation with the local tax office is enough to underline this point. So, interestingly, actually, I wouldn't cite access as my biggest challenge, but discoverability. I think that access to reliable discovery tools is an even more important thing than access to specific research papers. Interestingly, this topic came up at a family wedding. My cousin works as a science communicator, and she was saying that she finds it quite easy to get access to a specific paper just by putting an appeal on Twitter or something. But finding out what papers are interesting to look at is a much more difficult challenge, and this is an experience I echo. Now, of course, I know from research information and conversations that this market is changing all the time. Virtually every time I try Google Scholar, it seems a bit better than the last time. But it's not quite the same as the time I had complimentary access to Scopus for a few months. Obviously, I was accessing it for an article for research information, but it was handy to put it through its paces for another article I was writing. And this kind of tool, I think, is great for finding out the whole sort of background of a place. I'm currently experimenting how I can use Mendeley to be such a source. And we have an article in the next issue of Research Information about databases and potential disruptors in the database market. So, another limitation, geographical bias. This is a photo I took at the Paralympics. I happened to see the first athletics GB gold medal. At this point, I should probably confess to a potential bias. I'm British. I live in the UK, and my mother tongue is English. To be honest, this actually puts me in a very good position for finding out about what's going on in Europe and in English-speaking countries. But some places, as we've heard in all the previous speakers today, pose much greater challenges. Due to geography, time zones, language, culture. And when I asked other journalists about this, they said exactly the same things. So, starting point, the easiest places to find scientific stories from. This is a rough hierarchy that I put together. So the USA, of course, has a very high research output. Use of the internet in publicizing things is commonplace, and research institutions and researchers seem to be easy to get hold of and happy to speak to journalists. Universities in Europe don't seem to be quite so good at routinely sending out press releases for interesting research or making researchers available. Nonetheless, there's still plenty of this, and the involvement of the EU in publicizing Europe-wide projects helps. I've put the UK above the rest of Europe in my hierarchy for a couple of reasons. Firstly, there's the obvious issue of language. Secondly, for people like me, there's simply the fact that I live here. And more than once, I've found out a good story just by being in the pub with friends and talking to the researcher. Other people put Germany high on the list of really good places to get research stories for. As one of my friends said, Germany has a long tradition of engineering excellence and therefore just seems to produce an amazing amount of high-quality research. Seems maybe that there's going to be other places that will be, also able to have that definition, maybe even more so as time goes on. Interestingly, not all English-speaking countries were easy to source stories from. Australia and Africa, which of course includes many English-speaking countries, came up low on the list. Okay, so here's some places that are harder to find stories from. I find this is kind of discouraging because this is actually most of the world. And there's many diverse reasons which I'll be happy to chat some more detail about later, but of course we've been talking about the cultural issues, language issues, and other issues that make these kind of areas harder to deal with. Another challenge is researcher communication skills. So many researchers may be inexperienced with dealing with the press. They may not reply to emails or calls, even if their university's PR department or the journal publisher has set up a really good press release and made publicising their research really easy. They also may not be able to explain their work clearly. And oddly often they can have quite a fear of journalists. This is something I've experienced even when I was in my 20s, and I had a CTO of a large multinational company who was terrified of being interviewed by me. So I'm not sure how much this counts as a limitation. These are some mixed views people had on media embargoes. This is where a press release is prepared about a journal article before the journal article is published, and the media can set up interviews with the researchers before, but not actually publish it until the journal article comes out. To be honest, I used to think these were a good idea. I now find that there's just too many things to organise, and it just adds to the information overload. But as you can see from these quotes, there's some mixed views about this. Information overload is another issue, big issue for journalists as for researchers. This quote, I think, sums up the problem. I don't have a solution other than cloning myself, but it does seem to be an increasing challenge. However, I do argue that we need to have opportunity to see everything rather than having some filtering done by people who might not know what we're working on or may not be specialists in the area that we're writing about. And we're whizzing through this a bit because I know we're getting between here and the bar. So social media is, interestingly, I'm quite on the new end of using social media in work, but in terms of the other people I spoke to, I'm kind of almost an early adopter. People were saying to me that they don't really find it helps very much at all with what they do. They keep, all the responses were roughly along the lines of, I know I probably should use Twitter, but I don't. Or I follow some tweets, but they're all from sources I already follow, so there's nothing new there. I find as a tool for journalists it has huge limitations because it's hard to organise the level of comment, and the level of comment seems hugely outweighed by the number of retweets and links to other things. Also talk about what people had for dinner last night and that sort of thing. I also struggle with the asymmetry of it because I use a lot of Facebook socially. I'm used to the people who see my comments being the same people whose comments I see, and I'm still kind of adjusting to that. And the character limit, I think, is too small to have meaningful comments and discussion. Nonetheless, I've been using Twitter in a big way probably since May or June, and I've already commissioned 4 or 5 articles based on contacts through it, so I'm not going to be too hard on Twitter. So here are some suggestions for publishers, which will whiz through: distribute more press releases, send them to everyone who's expressed an interest, make it clear who journalists should talk to, include relevant URLs, and ensure that the headlines are in the subject of emails. Amazing how many people don't do that. Enable easier access, simple discovery, and ensure that it's possible to search. This is actually more my request on research information about the searching corporate information. And there's always a desire for images. If you want some research to be publicised, make sure there's good images. Makes a massive difference. For universities and researchers, it would be great to provide more training in communication. encourage them not to be frightened of journalists. We're not the enemy. I would say, and other people may say differently, always feel free to ask if you can check the facts and things, but there is also, journalists have a right to say no, and deadlines are very tight. There's also the opportunity to publicise what you're talking about at conferences. This is for researchers. So, in conclusion, I think there's a need for journalists and journals to work closer together, and also the researchers and research institutions. There's a need for better communication and understanding about the different roles, a need to break down red tape about access, about press access. And my vision will be some sort of authenticated discovery and access tool, especially for accredited journalists. Perhaps this is something that an existing discovery service could be involved in, or a new company, and I'll be really interested to hear your thoughts about this. I believe such moves could help scholarly research development to be reported more accurately and more often. So thank you for listening.